The clock struck 4:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, as Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder pressed his binoculars against the salt-stained glass of the landing craft. Through the pre-dawn darkness, the imposing cliffs of Point du Hoc loomed like ancient fortress walls, their limestone faces scarred by months of Allied bombardment. Below those cliffs waited the most heavily fortified German position on the entire Normandy coast, and Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion had volunteered to take it. "Sir, the first wave is forming up," Sergeant Jack Coon whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of diesel engines and crashing waves. Around them, the English Channel churned with the largest armada in human history, 5,000 ships carrying 160,000 Allied soldiers toward the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. Rudder nodded grimly, knowing that in less than 2 hours, his men would attempt something that military strategists called either brilliant or suicidal scully, a 90-foot cliffs under direct enemy fire to capture German artillery positions that could devastate the entire invasion fleet. The 6 massive guns atop Point du Hoc commanded both Omaha and Utah beaches, making their destruction absolutely critical to Operation Overlord's success. According to intelligence reports referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work D-Day, June 6, 1944, the German 116th Infantry Division had spent 3 years transforming these cliffs into an impregnable fortress. Concrete bunkers, interconnected tunnels, machine gun nests, and carefully positioned artillery pieces created overlapping fields of fire that could annihilate any assault force foolish enough to attempt a frontal attack. Yet here they were, 225 Rangers armed with rope ladders, grappling hooks, and an unshakable determination to prove that no position was truly impregnable. Rudder studied the faces of his men in the dim red light of the transports, some barely old enough to vote, others seasoned veterans of North Africa and Sicily. Each carried the weight of knowing that failure meant not just their own deaths, but potentially the collapse of the entire Western Front offensive. The German defenders had good reason for confidence. Oberst Gunther Kiel's Coastal Artillery Regiment had transformed Point du Hoc into what they called the Atlantic Wall's crown jewel. Every approach had been mined, every weakness reinforced with steel and concrete. The cliffs themselves seemed to mock any invasion attempt, smooth limestone faces offering precious few handholds, constantly battered by wind and spray that would make climbing treacherous even without enemy fire. But Rudder's Rangers had trained for 18 months specifically for this moment. They had practiced cliff scaling on the chalky cliffs of England's coast, perfected techniques for using rocket-fired grappling hooks under combat conditions, and memorized every detail of their target through aerial reconnaissance photographs. They knew that success depended not just on courage, but on executing a plan so audacious that the Germans would never expect it. As the landing craft pitched and rolled through increasingly heavy swells, Rudder checked his watch again. Each hour was approaching the precise moment when the fate of Western civilization would be decided on a narrow strip of French beach. Behind them, the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled, prepared to deliver democracy's answer to fascist tyranny. Ahead waited cliffs that had never been conquered, defended by an enemy that had never been defeated on their own ground. The thunder of naval guns had already begun echoing across the channel as Allied battleships commenced their final bombardment. Soon, Rudder knew that thunder would be joined by the battle cries of Rangers determined to prove that no fortress, however strong, could withstand the combined fury of free men fighting for their homelands. At exactly 5-40-5 on the morning of June 6, 1944, the first rocket-fired grappling hooks soared through the smoke-filled air toward the towering cliffs of Point du Hoc. Sergeant First Class Leonard Lomel watched with grim satisfaction as his hook found purchase in a shell crater near the cliff's edge, the reinforced rope uncoiling behind it like a lifeline to victory or death. Go, go, go. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's voice cut through the chaos as German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions above. The Rangers of Company D had trained for this moment through months of brutal preparation, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of scaling a 90-foot cliff. While enemy bullets whined overhead and artillery shells exploded in the surf below, the initial assault wave had already suffered casualties during the hazardous approach to the base of the cliffs. Naval coxswains, struggling against fierce currents and German artillery fire, had delivered some landing craft nearly a mile east of their intended target. But the Rangers adapted with characteristic flexibility, regrouping under fire and pressing forward despite the confusion that threatened to derail their carefully orchestrated plan. Private First Class Salva Maimon, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh, hauled himself hand over hand up a rope that swayed sickeningly in the offshore. When, below him, the English Channel crashed against limestone rocks stained with the blood of wounded comrades. Above, German defenders hurled grenades and fired down with mechanical precision, turning each foot of vertical progress into a hard-won victory. The intelligence reports that had shaped their mission plan, as documented in the official history of the Second World War series published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office, had accurately predicted the fortress's formidable defenses, but underestimated the Germans' determination to hold their positions. Major Werner Pluscat's observation post had been tracking the approaching Allied fleet since 3 o'clock that morning, providing advance warning that allowed the defenders to man their battle stations before the first Rangers reached the cliff base. Despite the murderous defensive fire, Lomel's squad achieved the impossible, reaching the cliff top. After 35 minutes of desperate climbing, what they found there defied all expectations and threatened to render their heroic sacrifice meaningless. The massive concrete gun emplacements that Allied intelligence had identified as containing 6 155mm artillery pieces stood empty, their steel and concrete chambers echoing with hollow mockery. "Where are the damn guns?" Lomel muttered, using his Thompson submachine gun to provide covering fire as more Rangers reached the summit. The elaborate deception had worked perfectly. Wooden decoys, positioned at full Allied reconnaissance, had drawn the full fury of pre-invasion bombardment. While the real artillery pieces remained hidden elsewhere, the Germans had constructed an intricate network of underground tunnels connecting observation posts, ammunition storage facilities, and alternate firing positions. As the Rangers spread out across the cratered moonscape of the cliff top, they discovered that capturing Point du Hoc was only the beginning of their mission. Somewhere in the Norman countryside, behind the coastal fortifications, the real guns waited to rain destruction on Allied forces struggling to establish their foothold on European soil. Rudder established his command post in a captured German bunker, its thick concrete wall scarred by naval gunfire, but still functional. Radio communications with the fleet remained sporadic due to equipment damage during the assault, leaving the Rangers effectively cut off from higher command. They had accomplished the impossible by taking the fortress, but their real objective, neutralizing the coastal artillery threat, remained unfulfilled. As German counterattacks began to probe the Rangers' hastily established defensive perimeter, the full magnitude of their situation became clear. They held a tiny foothold on the edge of occupied Europe, surrounded by enemy forces and running low on ammunition. The success of Operation Overlord might well depend on whether 200 Rangers could hold their position long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the main landing beaches. The sun climbed higher over Normandy, illuminating a scene of controlled chaos as Rangers consolidated their positions and prepared for the inevitable German response to their audacious assault. Staff Sergeant Leonard Lomel crouched behind a shattered concrete observation post as German mortars began their systematic bombardment of the captured cliff-top positions. Through gaps in the smoke and debris, he could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions that seemed to surround the Rangers' precarious foothold on Point du Hoc. But Lomel's attention focused not on the immediate threat, but on the intelligence puzzle that could determine the fate of thousands of Allied soldiers fighting to establish beachheads along the Norman coast. The empty gun positions mocked their desperate assault up the cliffs. Wooden decoys, masterfully crafted to full aerial reconnaissance, had drawn the full weight of Allied pre-invasion bombardment, while the real 155mm artillery pieces remained hidden somewhere inland. These guns possessed the range and accuracy to devastate both Omaha and Utah landing beaches, potentially turning Operation Overlord into the costliest failure in military history. At 8:30 that morning, while Lieutenant Colonel Rudder coordinated defensive preparations against German counterattacks, Lomel made a decision that would echo through history, taking Sergeant Jack Kuhn as his companion. He slipped away from the main defensive perimeter to conduct a reconnaissance patrol inland. Their mission was simple in concept, but potentially suicidal in execution: locate and destroy the missing artillery pieces before they could be brought into action against the invasion fleet. The Norman countryside beyond Point du Hoc revealed the complexity of German defensive planning, according to captured documents later analyzed by Allied intelligence services. As referenced in Max Hastings' authoritative account Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle for Normandy, The enemy had spent months preparing alternate firing positions, camouflage supply routes, and fallback positions designed to maintain artillery coverage, even if the primary coastal fortifications fell to assault. Lommel and Kuhn moved through hedgerow country that had been transformed into a defensive maze, ancient Norman field boundaries, reinforced with barbed wire and planted with anti-personnel mines, channeled any advancing force into carefully prepared killing zones. Machine gun nests commanded every intersection, while camouflaged observation posts provided overlapping surveillance coverage that made undetected movement nearly impossible. Yet the two Rangers possessed advantages that German planners had not anticipated. Their intensive training in small unit tactics, combined with desperate necessity, made them willing to take risks that conventional military doctrine would condemn as reckless. They used bomb craters for concealment, exploited gaps in German patrol schedules, and moved with the calculated precision of hunters tracking dangerous prey. Approximately 400 yards inland from the cliff-top positions, Lommel discovered what appeared to be a camouflage supply dump surrounded by carefully maintained camouflage netting. But as he studied the installation through his binoculars, details began to emerge that transformed suspicion into certainty. The metallic gleam of gun barrels, the geometric precision of artillery trails, and the systematic arrangement of ammunition supplies revealed the location of Point Du Hoc's missing thunder. All 6 155mm guns sat in a concealed battery position, their crews absent, but their ammunition ready for immediate use. The weapons had been positioned to provide devastating enfilade fire along both invasion beaches, while remaining invisible to Allied observation. Aircraft. German artillery doctrine called for rapid displacement to alternate firing positions once enemy forces located primary battery sites, but the speed of the Ranger assault had prevented this tactical withdrawal, working with methodical efficiency. Born of months of demolition training, Lommel and Kuhn approached their target through a drainage ditch that provided concealment from nearby German positions. Each artillery piece represented a threat to thousands of Allied soldiers, but destroying them required getting close enough to place thermite grenades in their breach mechanisms, a task that would expose the Rangers to immediate discovery and almost certain death. The sound of approaching German voices forced an immediate decision. Enemy personnel were returning to man their artillery pieces, probably in response to reports of heavy fighting along the landing beaches. Within minutes, these guns could begin the systematic destruction of Allied forces struggling to move inland from their precarious beachhead positions. Lommel checked his remaining thermite grenades and exchanged a meaningful glance with Kuhn. They had found their target, but neutralizing it would require exposing themselves to overwhelming enemy fire in broad daylight. The morning sun of June 6, 1944, cast long shadows across the camouflaged artillery position as Staff Sergeant Leonard Lommel counted the enemy soldiers moving between the concealed gun emplacements. 6 German artillerymen had returned to man their 155mm howitzers, their voices carrying clearly across the Norman countryside as they prepared to bring devastating fire upon the Allied landing beaches just 3 miles away. Lommel pressed himself deeper into the drainage ditch, feeling the cold mud seep through his field jacket as he calculated distances and timing. Each of the 6 artillery pieces posed a mortal threat to thousands of Allied soldiers struggling to establish footholds on Omaha and Utah beaches. Intelligence reports had estimated that these guns could fire 20 rounds per minute once fully manned, turning the invasion fleet into a shooting gallery for experienced German gunners. Sergeant Jack Kuhn crawled forward through the muddy water, his Thompson submachine gun ready, but useless against artillery pieces that could survive direct hits from naval gunfire. Their thermite grenades represented the only practical method for permanently disabling the guns, but using them required getting within arm's reach of weapons that stood in clear view of German defensive positions. The tactical situation grew more desperate. By the moment, radio communications from Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's command post had reported increasing German pressure against the Ranger positions on Point Du Hoc. Oberst Gunther Kiel's counterattack forces were probing the American defensive perimeter, seeking weak points that would allow them to recapture the cliff-top fortifications and restore their coastal artillery coverage. According to post-war German military records examined by the United States Army Center of Military History, the enemy had committed elements of the 900th and 14th Grenadier Regiment to contain the Ranger penetration, while artillery observers prepared to direct concentrated fire missions against the invasion beaches. Time was running out for both the isolated Rangers on the cliffs and the main invasion force. struggling to move inland. Lommel made his decision with the cold calculation of a professional soldier who understood that personal survival meant nothing. Compared to mission success, the artillery pieces had to be destroyed immediately before their crews could complete firing preparations and begin systematic bombardment of Allied positions. Working in coordinated silence, he and Kuhn began their approach through the drainage system that provided their only concealment from German observation posts. The first howitzer stood 20 yards from their position, its massive barrel elevated to provide plunging fire onto the landing beaches. German ammunition handlers were transferring high explosive shells from camouflaged storage bunkers to firing positions beside each gun, their methodical efficiency suggesting years of training and combat experience on the Russian front. Moving with desperate precision, Lommel reached the first artillery piece and quickly assessed its mechanical vulnerabilities. The thermite grenade had to be placed directly against the gun's breech mechanism to ensure complete destruction of its firing capability. But approaching the weapon meant exposing himself to immediate detection by enemy personnel. Working just yards away, a German artillery observer, scanning the horizon through powerful binoculars, suddenly stiffened and began reaching for his radio handset. Allied naval gunfire was falling short of its intended targets, and he was preparing to call for course corrections that would bring devastating, accurate fire onto the crowded landing beaches where American soldiers struggled to advance beyond the high water mark. The moment had arrived for decisive action. Lommel armed his first thermite grenade and sprinted toward the nearest howitzer, counting seconds until the chemical reaction would create temperatures hot enough to melt steel and permanently disable the weapon. Behind him, Kuhn provided covering fire as German soldiers finally spotted the Rangers and began shouting warnings to their comrades. The first explosion sent molten metal cascading across the gun position as the thermite burned through the howitzer's breech mechanism. But 5 artillery pieces remained functional, their crews now fully alert and reaching for personal weapons to engage the Rangers who had penetrated their carefully concealed position. Lommel armed his second grenade and ran toward the next gun emplacement, knowing that each destroyed howitzer represented hundreds of American lives that would be saved from artillery bombardment. The success of Operation Overlord might well depend on whether the Rangers could complete their desperate mission before German defenders overwhelmed their position. By 1100 hours on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder's command post at Point Duhok had become the nerve center for one of the most precarious operations in military history. The Rangers held a strip of cratered ground barely 400 yards deep, surrounded by German forces that grew stronger with each passing hour. Radio communications with the invasion fleet remained intermittent, leaving Rudder's men effectively isolated on their captured clifftop while the fate of Operation Overlord hung in the balance. The German counterattack began with methodical precision that reflected months of defensive planning. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, supported by armor from the 21st Panzer Division, launched coordinated assaults designed to drive the Rangers back into the sea. Machine gun fire swept the crater-marked landscape while mortar rounds fell with increasing accuracy on American positions. Hastily fortified with captured German equipment, Sergeant First Class Salva Maimon, the former Pittsburgh steelworker who had climbed the cliffs under fire just hours earlier, now found himself commanding a squad of Rangers defending a section of the perimeter against overwhelming odds. His position, built around a captured German bunker, offered some protection from artillery fire, but could not withstand a determined infantry assault. Supported by armor, conserve ammunition, Maimon shouted to his men as German soldiers advanced through the smoke and debris of the bombardment. Each Ranger carried limited supplies, and resupply from the beaches remained impossible while enemy forces controlled the inland approaches to Point Duhok. Every round had to count, every shot carefully aimed to maximize the defensive firepower of their dwindling force. The tactical situation that confronted Rudder's Rangers exemplified the complexity of amphibious warfare. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history, the invasion of France and Germany, success depended not just on capturing objectives, but on holding them long enough for follow-on forces to exploit initial gains. The Rangers had accomplished their primary mission by neutralizing the coastal artillery threat, but their strategic value would be meaningless if German counterattacks succeeded in eliminating their foothold on European soil. Staff Sergeant Leonard Lommel returned to the defensive perimeter just as the German assault reached its climax. His successful destruction of the hidden artillery battery had eliminated the immediate threat to the landing beaches, but the Rangers still faced annihilation unless reinforcements arrived soon. The thermite grenades had permanently disabled all 6 155mm howitzers, but German infantry remained determined to recapture their lost positions. Private First Class Otto Stevens, manning a captured German machine gun in a shell crater near the cliff edge, spotted enemy soldiers attempting to infiltrate the American lines through a communication trench that connected the clifftop bunkers. His accurate fire stopped the assault, but revealed his position to German mortar observers who immediately began ranging rounds on his location. The Rangers fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that retreat meant death. Behind them lay 90 feet of cliff and the churning waters of the English Channel. Ahead waited German soldiers fighting to defend their homeland against invasion. No quarter would be asked or given in this struggle that would determine whether democracy or fascism controlled the future of Western civilization. Radio operator Technical Sergeant James Eichner finally established contact with Allied naval forces offshore, calling for fire support to break up German troop concentrations preparing for another assault. The massive guns of the battleship Texas, 14 miles offshore, responded with devastating accuracy that scattered enemy formations and bought precious time for the embattled Rangers. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Norman countryside, Rudder assessed his tactical situation with grim realism. His force had suffered 40% casualties during the assault and subsequent defensive fighting. Ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted, medical supplies critically low, and German pressure showed no signs of diminishing. Yet they held their ground with stubborn determination, knowing that every hour they maintained their position brought the main invasion force closer to success. The Rangers of Point du Hoc had already accomplished more than anyone had dared hope. They had scaled impossible cliffs, captured a fortress considered impregnable, and eliminated artillery pieces that could have devastated the invasion fleet. Now they faced their greatest test, holding their position until relief forces could fight their way inland from the contested landing beaches. As the afternoon of June 6, 1944, wore on, the isolated Rangers at Point du Hoc faced their darkest hour. Technical Sergeant James Eichner's radio crackled with increasingly desperate messages from Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's command post. REPO or TING German infiltration attempts that threatened to split the American defensive perimeter. The enemy had committed additional forces from the 352nd Infantry Division, bringing the total German strength arrayed against the Rangers to nearly regiment size. Captain Ralph Goranson, commanding Company C from a reinforced shell hole near the inland edge of the position, watched through binoculars as German assault troops massed for another coordinated attack. Their previous attempts had been repulsed with heavy casualties on both sides, but enemy commanders showed no inclination to abandon their efforts to recapture the strategically vital clifftop. The Rangers' successful neutralization of the coastal artillery had eliminated one threat to Operation Overlord, but their continued occupation of Point du Hoc prevented German forces from establishing observation posts that could direct fire on the landing beaches. The tactical mathematics were grimly simple. Rudder's original force of 225 Rangers had been reduced to fewer than 150 effective fighters through casualties sustained during the cliff assault and subsequent defensive battles. German strength continued to grow as enemy commanders diverted troops from other sectors to eliminate what they correctly perceived as a dangerous penetration of their coastal defenses. Ammunition shortages had become critical. Each Ranger carried only basic combat loads when they began their assault, and resupply remained impossible while German forces controlled all land approaches to their position. Sergeant First Class Salva Maimon distributed captured German ammunition among his squad, but the foreign cartridges often proved incompatible with American weapons, forcing the Rangers to rely increasingly on captured enemy equipment. Medical supplies presented an even more serious problem. Rangers wounded during the cliff assault required immediate attention, but the unit's two medics could do little more than apply field dressings and administer morphine to ease suffering. Evacuation to aid stations remained impossible, leaving seriously wounded men to lie in hastily prepared medical shelters while their comrades continued fighting around them. According to accounts preserved in the National Archives and detailed in Carlo d'Este's authoritative work Decision in Normandy, the German commanders recognized that eliminating the Ranger penetration had become essential to maintaining their defensive strategy along the Norman coast. Major Werner Pluskett, commanding the Coastal Artillery Observation Network, had lost his primary observation post when the Americans captured Point Du Hoc, severely limiting his ability to direct counter-battery fire against Allied naval forces. The afternoon attack began with an artillery preparation that demonstrated German determination to recapture their lost positions. Mortar rounds and artillery shells fell with systematic precision on American positions, forcing the Rangers to take shelter in captured bunkers while enemy infantry moved forward. Under cover of the bombardment, the concrete fortifications that had protected German defenders now sheltered American soldiers, fighting to hold their precarious foothold on European soil. Staff Sergeant Leonard Lommel, exhausted from his successful mission to destroy the hidden artillery battery, returned to find his comrades engaged in desperate close-quarters fighting around the command bunker. German assault troops had penetrated the defensive perimeter at 2 points, threatening to split the Ranger force and eliminate their ability to coordinate defensive fire. The battle became a series of individual firefights as small groups of Rangers fought to prevent German soldiers from establishing permanent footholds within the American position. Private First Class Otto Stevens, still manning his captured machine gun despite multiple wounds, provided crucial covering fire that allowed other Rangers to reposition and maintain their defensive lines. As shadows began to lengthen across the Norman countryside, both sides recognized that the outcome of the battle for Point Du Hoc would influence the success of the entire invasion. The Rangers had accomplished their primary mission by neutralizing the coastal artillery threat, but their strategic value would be lost if German counterattacks succeeded in eliminating their observation capabilities and recapturing the vital cliff-top positions. The longest day of the war continued with no end in sight for the embattled Rangers, who had volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission. Dawn on June 7, 1944, revealed the true cost of the Rangers' magnificent obsession with holding Point Du Hoc. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder surveyed his shattered command from the scarred concrete bunker that had served as his headquarters through 36 hours of continuous combat. Of the 225 Rangers who had scaled the cliffs in the gray pre-dawn darkness of D-Day, only 90 remained capable of sustained fighting. The German counterattacks had continued through the night with relentless determination. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, reinforced by assault troops from the 352nd Infantry Division, had launched no fewer than 6 coordinated attacks designed to drive the Americans back into the sea. Each assault had been repulsed through a combination of superior fighting positions, devastating naval gunfire support, and the Rangers' unwavering determination to hold their ground at any cost. Technical Sergeant James Eichner's radio finally crackled with the message that Rudder's men had been waiting to hear for nearly 2 days. Advanced elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion, fighting their way inland from Omaha Beach, had broken through German defensive lines and were approaching Point Du Hoc from the southeast. The relief force, led by Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, had battled through fierce resistance to reach their embattled comrades before German forces could complete their annihilation of the isolated garrison, the sight of American soldiers advancing across the crater-scarred landscape brought tears to the eyes of veterans who had survived some of the war's most desperate fighting. Staff Sergeant Leonard Lommel, the hero who had single-handedly destroyed the German artillery battery, stumbled forward to meet the relief column with a mixture of exhaustion and overwhelming relief that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The strategic impact of the Rangers' successful assault extended far beyond the immediate tactical gains achieved by capturing Point Du Hoc. Their elimination of the coastal artillery threat had allowed Allied naval forces to provide uninterrupted fire support for the landing beaches, while their continued occupation of the cliff-top positions prevented German observers from directing accurate counter-battery fire against the invasion fleet, as documented in the official after-action reports preserved in the National Archives. The German High Command had committed substantial reserves to eliminate what they correctly identified as a dangerous penetration of their coastal defenses. These forces, diverted from other sectors to contain the Ranger threat, were not available to reinforce German positions facing the main Allied assault, contributing significantly to the overall success of Operation Overlord. The human cost of victory remained starkly evident as medical personnel began evacuating wounded Rangers to aid stations established behind the expanding Allied beachhead. Sergeant First Class Salva Maimone, the Pittsburgh steelworker who had become a symbol of Ranger determination, required immediate surgery for wounds sustained during the final German assault. Private First Class Otto Stevens, whose machine gun had broken up multiple enemy attacks, would carry German shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the assault and subsequent defense, summarized the Rangers' achievement in his final report to higher headquarters. They had accomplished everything asked of them and more, proving that no position was too strong to be taken by soldiers with sufficient courage and determination to see their mission through to completion. The cliffs of Point du Hoc, scarred by battle and littered with the debris of war, stood as testament to one of the most remarkable small unit actions in military history. 225 American soldiers had volunteered for a mission that conventional wisdom deemed impossible, scaled cliffs under fire, captured a fortress considered impregnable, eliminated a critical threat to the invasion fleet, and held their position against overwhelming odds until relief arrived. Their success helped ensure that June 6, 1944, would be remembered not as the day democracy failed in its greatest test, but as the beginning of fascism's final defeat. The Rangers of Point du Hoc had written their names in history with bullets and blood, proving that ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things. When fighting for the survival of freedom itself, the longest they had ended in victory, but with the courage of Rangers who refused to accept the impossible.